The whole premise of this latest trade war chapter was, in theory, quite simple. President Trump, reigniting the tariff battle back in February, operated under a core belief that America could squeeze China until it cried uncle. The strategy was to impose heavy tariffs, making Chinese goods so expensive that American consumers would stop buying them, thereby kneecapping the Chinese economy. The expectation was that Beijing, faced with economic ruin, would have no choice but to concede to US demands on everything from trade imbalances to intellectual property. It was a classic hit them where it hurts approach, assuming, of course, that we knew exactly where it hurt the most and that they couldn't just, find a new place to sell their stuff. This belief was supercharged last Friday, October 10th, when the administration announced a staggering new 100% tariff on all Chinese imports. This wasn't just turning up the heat, it was throwing the entire stove into a volcano. The move was a direct response to China's decision to control exports of rare earth minerals, those crucial ingredients for everything from iPhones to precision-guided munitions. The logic seemed to be that if China was going to restrict critical materials, the US would respond with an economic sledgehammer. The gamble was clear. By making the US market prohibitively expensive, Trump was betting that China's export-driven economy would falter, forcing them back to the negotiating table on America's terms. However, the fundamental assumption behind this bold strategy seems to have overlooked a rather significant detail about the modern global economy. It's a bit like a popular high school kid deciding to uninvite their rival to a massive party, only to find out that the rival was already planning to attend 5 other, even better parties that same night. The White House appeared confident that cutting off access to the American consumer base would be a fatal blow. But the world is a very big place, with many, many consumers who are more than happy to buy slightly cheaper electronics, textiles, and everything else under the sun, even if they have to learn a new language to read the instruction manual. The plan was meant to isolate China, to make it feel the economic pain of being shut out from the world's largest consumer market. In doing so, the US seemed to be banking on a world that is far more America-centric than it actually is in 2025. The tariffs were designed to be a show of overwhelming economic force, a clear signal that America still calls the shots. But what happens when the country you're trying to punish simply shrugs, turns to its other trading partners, and actually manages to increase its business? Well, you get a situation that is less of a strategic masterstroke and more of an incredibly awkward and expensive miscalculation, which is exactly where we find ourselves now. And that brings us to China's response, which has been less about panicking and more about some seriously savvy strategic pivoting. Instead of watching its economy crumble as US orders dried up, China executed a classic business maneuver: diversification. When sales to your biggest customer suddenly plummet, you don't just shut down the factory, you aggressively court new customers. And that is precisely what happened. While shipments to the United States took a nosedive, plunging by a dramatic 27% in September alone, China's exports to the rest of the world, particularly the European Union, started to surge. It turns out there are plenty of other countries eager for Chinese goods. The numbers here are genuinely startling and paint a picture completely at odds with the intended outcome of the tariffs. Despite the US doing everything it could to slam the door on Chinese products, China's total exports in September actually grew by 8.3% year over year, hitting a record $328.6 billion. This wasn't a minor uptick. It was a clear demonstration that China's export machine is far more resilient and adaptable than Washington anticipated. By focusing on markets in Europe, Southeast Asia, and beyond, China effectively rerouted its economic engine, proving that its global trade relationships were strong enough to withstand the loss of a significant portion of its American business. This strategic shift is further validated by the latest economic forecasts from the World Bank. In a stunning revision, the institution upgraded China's 2025 GDP growth forecast from 4.0% to a much healthier 4.8%. Meanwhile, the forecast for the United States tells a very different story, having been cut down to a sluggish 1.4%. So, to recap, the country imposing the crippling tariffs is projected to grow at a snail's pace, while the country being targeted is seeing its economic outlook actively improve. It's like trying to sink your neighbour's boat by drilling a hole in your own. It's a bold move, yes, but perhaps not a particularly effective one. Ultimately, China has demonstrated that its economic fate is no longer solely tied to the whims of the American consumer. By cultivating a diverse portfolio of trading partners over the years, it built a buffer that has now been put to the ultimate test and has, so far, passed with flying colours. The narrative that China needs the US market to survive is looking increasingly outdated. While losing American customers certainly stings, it has proven to be a manageable problem rather than an existential crisis. China's ability to pivot so successfully has fundamentally altered the power dynamics of this trade war, leaving the US with a much weaker hand than it thought it held. Of course, a trade war isn't just fought with tariffs and export data. It's also a public relations battle fought with fiery rhetoric and thinly veiled threats. Unsurprisingly, both sides have been pulling out all the stops. In response to the new 100% tariffs, China's Commerce Ministry immediately warned it would take corresponding measures, which is the diplomatic equivalent of saying, "You're going to regret that." Beijing masterfully framed the US complaints about its rare earth export controls as a blatant double standard, pointing out that America can't exactly restrict high-end semiconductor sales to China, and then get upset when China leverages its own dominance in a critical sector. It's a classic what's good for the goose is good for the gander argument. On the other side of the Pacific, President Trump employed his signature brand of bombastic diplomacy. He described China's move to control rare earth minerals as sinister and hostile, language usually reserved for rogue states, not major trading partners. For a moment, he even threatened to cancel his upcoming meeting with President Xi Jinping at the APEC summit in South Korea, a move that would have signaled a complete breakdown in communication. While he later softened that stance, the initial threat sent a clear message. The gloves were off. This wasn't just a trade dispute anymore. It was being framed as a clash between two fundamentally opposed global powers. The escalation wasn't just talk either. China has a long history of using non-tariff barriers to make its displeasure known, and it has already started pulling those levers. It has reportedly cut back on purchases of US soybeans, a painful blow to American farmers who have been caught in the crossfire of this conflict for years. Furthermore, it has matched US port fee increases, adding yet another layer of cost and complexity for American businesses trying to operate in China. These moves are subtle but effective, designed to inflict targeted economic pain without resorting to the blunt instrument of across-the-board tariffs. This war of words and retaliatory actions has pushed the two nations further apart, eroding what little trust remained after a fragile truce was shattered. The November 10th deadline for a new trade agreement, which once seemed plausible, now looks like a distant fantasy. The official responses have become a performance for domestic audiences as much as a message to the other side. Both leaders need to appear strong and unyielding, which makes finding a compromise incredibly difficult. The cycle of tit-for-tat escalation has created a vortex of hostility that will be hard to escape, even if both sides secretly want to. When governments start playing chicken with the global economy, financial markets tend to get very, very nervous. And nervous they got. Following Trump's announcement of 100% tariffs, Wall Street had a full-blown panic attack. The S&P 500 dropped over 2%, and the Dow Jones Industrial Average plummeted 879 points, marking the worst day for the market since April. It was a clear and immediate verdict from investors. This escalation is bad for business, bad for profits, and bad for everyone's 401ks. The ripple effects were felt globally, with the UK's FTSE 100 also taking a significant hit. Markets, it turns out, hate uncertainty even more than they hate actual bad news. Interestingly, while US and European markets were seeing red, markets in China remained relatively steady. This relative calm can be attributed to a couple of factors. First, the bad news was, to some extent, already priced in after months of simmering tensions. Second, and more importantly, China's successful export diversification and strong economic data provided a cushion of confidence. Investors there seem to be betting on their country's ability to weather this storm. Even the notoriously volatile world of cryptocurrency had a bizarre reaction, with Bitcoin initially dropping 8% before rebounding after it became clear China wasn't going to announce an immediate, catastrophic retaliation. Despite the market chaos and the harsh political rhetoric, a surprising consensus is emerging among seasoned experts. This might all just be extreme negotiating theatre. Analysts at major financial institutions like UBS and Deutsche Bank have suggested that both sides still fundamentally want to reach a deal. They argue that Trump's maximum pressure tactic is a high-risk, high-reward gambit designed to force China into making concessions it otherwise wouldn't. The idea is that by pushing things to the absolute brink, you create the political space necessary for both leaders to then step back and frame any compromise as a major victory. And so, we are left in a state of suspended animation. The tariffs are set to take effect, the threats have been made, and the markets are on edge. Yet, behind the scenes, the prevailing wisdom is that negotiations will resume because the alternative, a full-scale, long-term economic decoupling, is simply too damaging for both countries to truly stomach. Markets are betting that this is the darkest before the dawn moment. The hope, however faint it may seem right now, is that this dramatic escalation is not the beginning of a permanent economic Cold War, but rather the final chaotic act before a new agreement is finally hammered out. We'll just have to wait and see.